Hi, I'm Arn Menconi, and I have a real special guest today. Her name is Kate Gould. I met Kate back in January of 2015 when Thomas Hedges of The Real News and I were doing a story on the Iran deal, and she was one of the leaders on the legislative team for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. How you doing, Kate?
Doing great. Good to talk with you, Arn.
Kate, could you tell our viewers what you do for what most people know as of FCNL.org?
Sure. So I lead the lobbying work on Middle East policy for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. So we're a Quaker lobby in the public interest. We have more registered peace lobbyists than any other lobby in Washington, D.C., and we work with people all across the country to advance peace and justice and good governance here in Washington. So I lead our work on Middle East policy, and that means Iran, Israel-Palestine, and Iraq and Syria.
Well, you're blowing up on Twitter and on Facebook, and you're getting interviews because about a week ago, what's called Implementation Day took place, in which the agreement with Iran went into effect. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a big day, big time for all of us who've been working on this for so long, and I'm sure many listeners have as well. So what we've seen is that 2016 just began, but already there's been these historic breakthroughs in U.S.-Iran relations. So this agreement, the Iran nuclear agreement, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's sort of the technical term, it was reached this summer, and we saw just about a week and a half ago, it went fully into effect. It was fully implemented. So that means that Iran had to take all these different steps to dramatically shrink its nuclear program, and in exchange, the U.S. started lifting sanctions on Iran. So it's something that FCNL has been working for nearly a decade, and I know that many people around the country have been working for it for years as well. We also saw that 5 U.S. citizens who have been held in Iranian captivity, some of them for years, were released. So it's a big, big time to show just how important diplomacy is and how it can yield results that no one would have thought would have been possible. And we also saw that U.S. sailors who had accidentally ventured into Iranian territorial waters, that they were first under Iranian captivity, but then released in less than 24 hours because there has been now this channel of dialogue between the U.S. and Iran that's finally established and can really work to avert what otherwise could have been an enormous crisis, a crisis in the Middle East. So diplomacy has already made the world a safer place. It's prevented Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, prevented another war, and prevented these American prisoners from being held any longer than they were.
Well, I got very involved with the Iran deal and actually worked with MoveOn.org in order to lobby our Democratic legislators here in Colorado in order to support the Iran deal, and all of them voted in favor of the Iran deal. But it was hotly contested, and rather than going into how it almost didn't get the support of the Senate, we now have a way of showing to people just how diplomacy can work over war. And what we're hearing in the news on a day-to-day basis almost is the leading Republican candidate, Donald Trump, keeps saying this was the worst deal ever and that billions of dollars were handed over to Iran. But tell us, from your standpoint after working on it for 10 years, let's demystify what the conservatives are saying and the war hawks are saying and get into how diplomacy is actually getting played out. And what are the objections that a person who doesn't know this topic as well should understand that those are just throwaway lines that people are using to scare you and what's really happening?
Right. Well, yes, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, first and foremost, this is an agreement about preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and preventing the U.S. from going to war with Iran over that issue. And that's, we've seen that the U.S. and Israel have gotten very close to that point where it seemed like war was inevitable. But a few years of diplomacy has taken us to an entirely new direction and off that path of confrontation, and onto a path of disagreement. And so, what this agreement has done is it has ensured, right now, for the first time in a decade, Iran does not have enough fuel to build a nuclear weapon. So this is huge. This is a dramatic success. We've seen that Iran has cut off, this agreement rather has cut off Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon through any of the four different ways that it may be used to achieve that. So we have seen that this is an enormous boost for nonproliferation. And I think as far as the criticism, there's been criticism that Iran gets to have a nuclear program at all at the end of this. Whereas it's just not reasonable to think that Iran would ever negotiate to give up its nuclear program entirely, to be able to enrich uranium on its own soil. So we know that Iran is going to insist upon having a nuclear program for electricity, but the question for the world was whether Iran was going to go farther than that and actually use their nuclear program for military means. But thanks to this agreement, that's not happening. I think the other criticism that we hear a lot is that Iran has atrocious human rights records, that they are supporting extremism throughout the region, and certainly the U.S. has enormous problems with Iran, and many of those problems unfortunately are going to continue. But the real question is, what do we do about it? And we know that diplomacy is not about negotiating with your Facebook friends, right? I mean, it's actually about talking with adversaries, de-escalating conflict, and making this world a safer place. And that's what the agreement's done. You mentioned, Donald Trump has talked about throwing billions, or whatever, throwing all this money at the Iranians. Well, one thing that should be noted is that this money it's not U.S. taxpayer money. It's Iran's money. Iran gets back its money that was frozen by the U.S. and frozen in banks when the U.S. and Iran cut off diplomatic relations after the hostage crisis decades ago. So it's simply getting back its own money, as well as getting sanctions relief that have so devastated its economy. So the whole idea of diplomacy is based on give and take. It required compromise, and that compromise was finally achieved. And as a result, the world does not have to live in fear anymore about yet another war in the Middle East. And we know that Iran is prevented from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
One of the reasons I wanted to interview you is because some of the people who are going to watch this are going to be from the Middle East. And I want them to see that there are citizens and there are efforts in all different shapes and forms here in the United States that is working towards diplomacy with countries and trying to make the world safer. While they may be hearing the message of "we're going to war" and a war hawks message, I want people to hear a message of peace and nonviolence. The leader of Iran, Rouhani, is, as we speak, in Europe, working with heads of states and businesses in Europe in order to open up trade with other countries in Europe. The deal was put together with the P5+1, which is out of the United Nations, which is essentially China, China, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. So it was an international group of people that brought this together, and it was the United States that was the last one in to come in favor of the agreement. You had said you'd worked on this agreement for 10 years. Is there any short answer to how this got initiated or why this got initiated, so that people could see the collaborative process that was behind it?
Right. Good question. I mean, first, a quick clarification. So, FCNL has worked on this for nearly 10 years. I have worked on it, let's see, for about 7 years or so. And so not quite the whole time, but it has been tremendously exciting to see how this issue has changed over the time that I was working here. I've been working on this. The U.S. was the last country to join this negotiating process. The European Union had begun it, during the Bush administration, and the Bush administration was not willing to fully participate. After the Obama administration came in 2009, then they said that they would. They did a Iran policy review, and then they decided, based on that they would fully participate in the process. And then once the negotiations got going, then we saw that the U.S. was fully engaged. So it was slow to join the process, but then certainly Secretary Kerry, for example, played a very pivotal role in actually achieving the final agreement. And I think as far as why this happened, it's a good question. And I think what we did see a dramatic change around, in the whole dynamics of these negotiations, I mean, of course, was when the U.S. agreed, and I should say the whole P5+1, or the U.S. at that time, the Europeans and the U.S. agreed that they would allow for an Iranian nuclear program, a domestic enrichment program, and they would allow for for Iran to maintain the sort of bottom lines that it had. And then on the Iranian side, they decided that they were willing to agree with intrusive inspection regimes and a lot of limitations on their side. And you were talking about people in the Middle East watching this. I mean, I would certainly say that this agreement came about because there were people around the world who insisted that their elected leaders would move forward toward a diplomatic solution to this issue. And we saw that in Iran. We saw that with people campaigning for President Rouhani in Iran, who was elected on a platform of more moderate relations with the United States, and Europe. And we saw that in the U.S. with people who pressed for the Obama administration to engage with Iran directly. So and certainly in Europe and with those other countries, but it was certain. The U.S. and Iran were two key countries in all this, in making this happen, and the U.S. and Iranian publics were two key publics. So I think ultimately it happened because finally our leaders were willing to compromise, and that's when negotiations can work. That's when dramatic breakthroughs that no one thought was possible, when it looked like there was going to be war, that's when we can see a real shift in those paradigms.
When I got excited, I like how you laid out the sort of tapestry of what it takes on something this complicated. Rouhani got elected, I believe it was about 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
August 2013.
And part of the Green Revolution that was trying to take place in Iran had a big effect on changing the narrative in Iran. So we have to give a lot of credit to the Iranian people who helped move their country to a greater diplomacy. We also have to give a lot of acknowledgement to the anti-nuclear organizations in America like Plowshare and Global Zero that work so hard on this too in your organization. So now what we're seeing played out in the news, and I don't always trust what I hear in the news. I prefer to go to you and people like you who are right across the street from the Capitol, is we're seeing that the media is covering that now the U.S. is trying to place more sanctions on Iran after the lifting of sanctions and the opening of the Iran deal. It's a little confusing. Can you help us sort that one out?
Sure. Well, so first thing that's important to understand is that the sanctions that the U.S. has now begun to lift are those directly related to Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. still has a lot of sanctions still in place. The trade embargo between our countries is still in place. So what has been lifted are a number of sanctions that the president alone can lift. Now, there are other sanctions which only Congress can lift. And so all of us, that means all the people who do want to see this agreement continue to work, to see diplomacy work, have a lot of work to do in the coming years in ensuring that, and it could be even 8 years from now, but that Congress will eventually vote to lift sanctions, lift all the nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. But there are still a number of areas where the U.S. Continues to impose sanctions. So that's on human rights violations, on the ballistic missile program that Iran has, and on terrorism, so on Iran's support for terrorism in the region. Those sanctions continue, and in fact, they may even be escalated and going forward. Although, I mean, there's been so many sanctions on Iran, it's hard to figure out how to sanction Iran any further on those issues. But we did see that right after the U.S. citizens were freed from Iran, after they left Iranian airspace, then the Obama administration announced new sanctions designations for Iran's ballistic missile program. So the Obama administration's been getting a lot of heat on this. They've been getting a lot of pressure from Congress, from, I should say, Republicans and Democrats in Congress to impose new sanctions on Iran for its ballistic missile tests. Now, Iran has made these tests in violation of a UN Security Council resolution. The fact of the matter is, Iran had tested its ballistic missile program before the agreement and afterwards. It's not anything new. It is a violation of the UN Security Council resolution. It's not a violation of the agreement. Iran has scrupulously adhered to every aspect of the actual nuclear agreement. But these other aspects of their ballistic missile program, they have continued to flout UN Security Council resolution. And now, unfortunately, that'll likely continue until there are real limitations on other countries in the regions and their ballistic missile programs. So, for example, on Saudi Arabia and on Israel, and we need the U.S. to work for a real security framework for the whole region that will de-escalate the various conventional arms races and ballistic missile arms race. So that's an issue that will continue. There's other issues that will continue. It was criticized in Iran, of course, the new sanctions imposed by the U.S. on their ballistic missile program. It could have a negative effect in terms of sending a message to the Iranian government, to some in Iran, that the sanctions are just going to continue and there's not going to be a break to them. I think so far we've seen that there haven't been any major escalations, and that's a really good thing. I think that's a real testament to how diplomacy has prevented those who have the hardliners in both countries who want to see confrontation have helped cool things down and have ensured that cooler heads can prevail when we see these moments of tension. But it's definitely something to watch, I would say, and it's all the more reason why we have to prevent Congress from further escalations, why we have to prevent Congress from, expanding new sanctions. We've already seen the administration has imposed new sanctions. So even those in Congress who said we have to do something, and even though these ballistic missile sanctions or any sanctions aren't likely to change Iran's behavior, even when that's happening, there are some in Congress who still want to go ahead with even more sanctions. So that's what we have to guard against, and we have to keep showing. You talked about how people worked in Colorado with Move On, with other organizations, and that work was just phenomenal. I will get a special shout out to Colorado in particular. I was amazed by how many town hall meetings that there were just flooded with people who supported the agreement, and I think it's not a coincidence that the whole Democratic delegation did support the agreement. So, but we got to keep that pressure up. We did see that we did see after Rouhani was elected in the summer of 2013, and then he was inaugurated in August. But in between that time, we saw that Congress passed new sanctions, even when there was this new president that had campaigned on a platform of change, and that had provoked some hardline responses in Iran to escalate on their end. So that's what we have to guard against, is this retaliatory escalation, tit for tat escalation on both sides, and have to keep pressing ahead for support for the agreement.
Well, to kind of wrap up part of this, and I'll give a couple of a bigger picture overview, is that we've known for about 10 years that there's a group of war hawks and think tanks in the United States Congress that would love us to go to war against Iran. It's been discussed when I interviewed former Chief of Staff for Colin Powell, Larry Wilkerson. He talked about how you and others had sat down with McCain and other members of the Senate, Lindsey Graham, and he had said, "Do you know how many troops that could take?" And they said, "We don't care." And it could take 100,000 troops to do something like that. We also saw just the day of the State of the Union address, where 10 American soldiers were taken into custody because they went into Iranian waters, and if the shoe was on the other foot, same thing probably would have happened. But as Trita Parsi and others had said, it was probably due to the diplomacy that had been occurring that they were released so quickly. We heard throughout the Iran deal that why are we doing this Iran deal when there is prisoners, American prisoners, that they won't release, and they were released on implementation day. So, you do diplomacy not with your friends and allies. People have to understand diplomacy is used with people who you might be considering as your enemies. And it is cost savings. But the most important thing that people always lose sight of is it would mean hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent lives lost if we were to go to war with a country the size of Iran. So what would you like people who are watching to do now that we have this victory for diplomacy to do in order to help keep the momentum going?
Great. One thing that everyone can do right now is go to fcnl.org/Iran and sign up for updates there. And an immediate action that you can take that would be so helpful for all of us working on this issue, and really in order to see this agreement through, is to write a letter to the editor. And if you don't want to do that, you can just use the text that we've already drafted, and we have an action alert online. I'll also make sure Arn, that you have it for your video, to put it in any description of the video. People can just click on it right after this video, and it'll send a draft letter to the editor. You can use our text or use your own, and then it'll go directly to papers in your local area and be submitted for publication. Hopefully, we've seen that many of these have been published, that just in the last few years, FCNL's network has published hundreds, over 350 letters to the editor, pro-diplomacy, supporting the agreement with Iran or the negotiations before there was an agreement. And then we can take those letters to the editor. Me, my colleagues here can take them to your Senate offices and show that there is indeed support for diplomacy going forward, that there's support for this agreement. And one thing that I think many would be surprised by is that while, unfortunately, we didn't have Republican members of Congress voting in support of the agreement, we have talked to a number of offices, Republican offices, I've talked to Republican senators, some of them who have been in the front lines against this agreement, and they said that at the time when I talked to them that they would support implementation going forward. But that's still going to be in jeopardy, and we've already seen proposals in Congress to try to move forward, more saber rattling, more escalation. And so that's why it's worth reaching out to everyone, whoever your member of Congress is. Just think, when we have to make sure that in the end we have, that we build up to the point where Congress will actually lift sanctions on Iran, and certainly, first and foremost, won't destroy this agreement by violating, the agreement or threatening to violate the agreement with new sanctions that are, in direct contradiction to what the agreement is all about. So people can go to fcnl.org/Iran, find out more ways to be engaged. We will update you about key moments where your member of Congress is particularly important, and look forward to being in touch, because certainly your member of Congress is hearing from the opposition, hearing from those who are opposed to talks, opposed to dialogue with Iran. So it's very important they hear from you.
Kate, I want to tell Coloradoans that they need to get on, send out their notes and their positions in favor of the Iran deal, specifically to Senator Cory Gardner, because Senator Gardner for the past couple of weeks has been taking a very negative posture position with the Iran deal. He's been sending out press releases. I spoke to him about a week ago, but it's important for him to hear, and it's important for you to get on his Twitter account and let him know you're in favor of it. Other people are doing this. I've been watching his Twitter account very closely. It's very effective. We just had the 25th anniversary of, the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring in Egypt, which brought about so much change. And it brings so much sadness to me that about 850 people's lives were lost in that square, and about another 6,500 people were injured. They fought for freedom. They fought for democracy, thought they had it. They had a democratic election, and I won't get into all the things that happened after that. You should know it. But this message goes out from Kate and I to the people who are watching, who are fighting for democracy everywhere, specifically in war-torn areas where there's so much refugees and dying. And we're there for you. We're trying to do things to help you. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Ron.